For me, education is one of the most important parts of your internal compliance program, the ICP. Without having the proper education within your company to ensure that every one of your colleagues is following the trade compliance needs of your company and to investigate all the bits and parts of training within your company out of a trade compliance perspective, this trade compliance talks takes you all the way from how to do it yourself, the benefits of outsourcing the trade compliance training, and many more aspects within the training and educational field of trade compliance. But as usual, I'm not the one doing all the talk and providing all the awesome information. In this episode of the Trade Compliance Talk, I had the benefit of talking trade compliance training and education with no one less than Mr. Scott Gearity from ECTI. So buckle up and enjoy. Hello everyone, and welcome to this Trade Compliance Talk where we are talking with Scott Gearity from ECTI. So hello to you and thank you for joining. Please introduce yourself and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Anders. It's my pleasure to be with you today, you and your audience. So I am Scott Gearity with the Export Compliance Training Institute, or ECTI. So ECTI is an organization that is a leader in training on export controls and sanctions. We've been in business for more than 20 years. We do public seminars, we do private training for companies and governments and other organizations. And we also offer a lot of different e-learning, hopefully something we'll be able to talk more about later today. And personally, so I've been working in the field of export controls for my entire career, actually. I'm one of those weird people who went straight into this. Not that I knew anything about it when I got started, because I didn't, but I've been working in this field for the entirety of my career. I started off working as a consultant, like a baby consultant, for a firm in Washington that specializes in export controls. Eventually went to go work as a trade compliance manager for a tech company, first based in the US and then based in Europe, and did that for a while. And then when I came back to the US, I got back into doing consulting. Still do a little bit of consulting, but mostly now for the last decade and a half or so, I've been focusing on training people on these pretty technical and sometimes challenging aspects of export controls and sanctions.
Awesome. Actually, I participated in one of your trainings 10 years ago in Amsterdam.
Yeah. I always like going there. We've been doing Amsterdam for a long time. We usually get a very, very sort of diverse group of people in continental Europe when we do training. It's actually a part of how I learned a lot was trying to answer questions from people who were thinking about this from a really different perspective and already knew a lot when they walked in the doors that morning.
Yeah, because I always say that working at a European company and having to deal with the US trade compliance regulations, it is not always a fit for the business because we need to comply with the US export regulations, but we never do export. We either do import or re-export. So the language in the regulations is not a perfect fit for our processes and business and how we do. So it's quite interesting to have U.S. trade compliance in Europe, actually.
Not to mention having to help your colleagues understand why they need to work with U.S. export controls in Europe, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're like, what do you say? What did you say? What do we need to follow? Yeah, so that's always a challenge, of course. But the first question that I'm going to ask you is usually a surprise question, but you almost answered it already. So the first question that I ask everyone that I talk with is, how did you end up in trade compliance?
So, I can be a little bit more specific, right? So I think this is true of most people who are in this field. Very few people go to school, university, college, right, with the intention of getting into export controls. There are a few programs that are out there, not a lot even today, and definitely there was nothing, 25 years ago when I first started doing this, right? So when I knew, that I was interested in international affairs, international trade, economics, when I went to university, that's part of why I wanted to go to school in Washington And so I went to American University in DC. But my original plan was actually to be a diplomat. So I wanted to join the U.S. Foreign Service and go, wherever they needed me to represent my country in the Foreign Service. But this was the late 1990s, and I think you're a little younger than me, Anders. But for people for the youngsters who may be listening to your podcast, they may not remember that in the late 90s, the prevailing view was that the U.S. and its Western allies had won the Cold War, and it was sort of the end of history, right? Actually, a famous piece written called "The End of History" by Francis Fukuyama. And from the U.S. point of view, the U.S. was more relevant to me. The U.S. was closing embassies and consulates around the world, not all of them, but quite a few of them. So consequently, even though I finished college and I took all the exams to be in the Foreign Service and I passed them, when I heard back from the State Department, they said, great, you're in to the Foreign Service, but we don't have any openings right now. So we're going to put you on a wait list, and one day we'll send you a letter. We'll let you know that we've got a spot for you. And that's when I realized, well, maybe I will hear from them one day. And I did. But meanwhile, I am done with college. I need to get a job. I need to pay the rent. And so we were seeking for something else to do. And that's when I found an opening happened very accidentally, right? And found an opening at a firm that just happened to specialize in export controls. And at the time, I knew a little bit about international trade. I'd done some internships in like the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And for people who don't know anything about this, they might think, well, it's sort of related, right? But they have nothing to do with each other. And I didn't know anything about export controls or sanctions. And so for me, I was starting with zero, but I got into this company that specialized in this area, and probably good for me, probably not as good for the company's clients, the firm's clients, right? It was small. I was very junior, but they threw me into working with clients pretty much right away. And so it was a great opportunity to learn about it. And I sort of stuck with it, decided, hey, I like this. This is close enough to what I'm interested in. And it's nice. One thing I learned actually from my first boss there that she told me was, it's nice to be an expert in something. And in a way, it almost doesn't matter what you're an expert in. But for me, it's become export control. So that's how I got started in it years ago, and have just sort of kept it and done it from a few different perspectives, functionally and sort of geographically since.
That's awesome. I always say that I had a career plan, and it took a left turn, and here I am within trade compliance. So it's always interesting to hear someone's story. How did you end up in trade compliance? And I think I worked at logistics, and I had a plan to work within HR and organizational development. And then I got a consultancy mission to develop a supply chain, a flow of material. And that flow of material happened to be export controlled. And then they recruited me to that company's trade compliance department. And before I even knew it, I was stuck with trade compliance. I didn't know what hit me, but here I am, and I'm enjoying it every day.
Good.
Yeah. Yes. But how does training enhance overall export control compliance within an organization, do you think?
So I think there's a lot of uses and misuses of training, right? For me, when I think about a compliance program, and we're talking mostly export compliance here, although a lot of this would also be true of more broadly of trade compliance, like including customs or import compliance, which is often thought of as a sort of subspecialty, right, within trade compliance, the way that export controls are. I think of it as being sort of a three-legged stool, right, mainly for a program, for a compliance program. And one of the legs of that stool is people, broadly, right, people. So part of that is, do you have the right people on your staff, right? Do you have enough of people on your staff? And do you have those people in the right places, right? Like the right places in the organization, or times the right places geographically, right? Because sometimes you need people actually on the ground. In a multinational company, you need people who are on the ground, right, in certain regions of the world, maybe all regions of the world. So you get all these people issues. To me, training is part of that aspect of a program, because part of that is not just those factors, but also, are you giving those people the training that they need in order to be successful in their work? And this, of course, is not just relevant to the people who are the trade compliance managers, right, or specialists, but to more people than that, broader audience within the organization. So training is really essential to equipping people with the skills and the expertise to do their jobs. And because this is an area where there is limited formal, in the sense of, go to university and study this thing, limited formal educational opportunities, for most people, this happens on the job, right? It happens while they're working for some kind of organization, either literally on the job, meaning they watch other people, they learn from mentors, and that stuff is really important, but also being able to get the right professional training in those roles. So it's really important for that aspect of the compliance program. However, it's not like a substitute for other things. Sometimes I hear from people and they think it's usually some crisis has happened or some violation or some investigation, right? And they're like, okay, we'll put everybody in the room and we'll train the heck out of them. I don't know if I have to use what kind of language I should use on this podcast, but we'll just train them. Okay. And so I'll try to keep it clean. So we'll just train them, right? And that is usually not a very good approach, right, to doing it. And it's not enough because there's other aspects of a compliance program, right? There's all the policies that you have and the procedures that are built upon that. That's another leg of the stool. There is all the systems that you need to support your program to make it more efficient and foolproof and better document things and have records of things. And training's not going to substitute for either of those, but it is, I think, a really key part of the people leg, right, of the stool for an overall program. That's sort of kind of how I go into it thinking of.
And don't worry about the language. Kids are not the target audience for this podcast. So
kids love export controls. What are you talking about?
Yeah, all the 11 years old wanting to be trade compliance superheroes.
Makes sense to me.
Yes, of course. Who wouldn't be a trade compliance superhero instead of being a knight in shiny armor? And what key elements do you think companies should include in their compliance program or compliance training?
So, when they make a plan, they need to have a plan for it, right? The same way that you want to have, as part of your program, you need to plan how you're going to implement elements of it. The same thing should be true of training, right? It shouldn't be just totally ad hoc. Sometimes it is. I mean, sometimes it's necessary to do that because you have a particular need, right? But it really there should be a plan for how you're going to train people within your organization. That means who you're going to train, at which level you're going to train them, how frequently you're going to train them, right? So when I think about this, I think about it in terms of sometimes like a pyramid, in that you've got, in a typical organization, you've got kind of a base of people at the bottom of the pyramid, right, who need kind of a thin layer of training. And at the base of the pyramid, it's the widest part. So you have a lot of people in the organization who need to understand at a basic level what export controls are, right? What trade compliance is, why it matters, why it's relevant to something they do. And then just enough information to sort of issue spot at a basic level so that they have enough information to be able to identify, okay, if this is going on, this could be considered, maybe they didn't even realize that could be considered an export. So maybe I need to check in with my subject matter expert on this, right? Here's the major things I need to watch out for that could be red flags of diversion. Here's why it's important to consider these basic issues. Just a thin layer to equip them with enough information so that they can spot a potential issue or problem and get help from people who know more before they proceed, right? Because there's a lot about this which is not necessarily very intuitive. So you need to help people understand that. So that might be like the bottom of the pyramid. I'm going to skip to the top, like the top of the pyramid. The top of the pyramid might be people who are subject matter experts or who need to have that level of sort of practitioner training. And so like a pyramid, there's not many people at the very top. So in most organizations, depending on the size, that could just be one or two people. In bigger organizations or organizations that are more heavily regulated, it could be a larger number. But you've got that smaller number that needs more in-depth practitioner level training. In most organizations, you need to go outside to get that, right? You need to go out to get that help. Not always, but because it's just more efficient. So you go to somebody who can provide that training like us or somebody else, right? And then, but where I feel like a lot of organizations actually, maybe the hardest part isn't the top or the bottom of the pyramid, it's like the middle. In the middle are people who are not the trade compliance people or team or personnel, But they are people who have a specific role in the program who need to be better equipped. They need more than just the basics, right? But they also need something that's tailored to what they do, what you're asking them to do. So if somebody is in purchasing or somebody is in HR or you're dealing with international salespeople, right? Those folks are all going to have specific responsibilities within a program, but they're different, right? They're different from each other. And so they all need more than the basic level training, but what they need should be specific and tailored to that. And sometimes, and that's hard, that's harder for most organizations because getting that, identifying those people, targeting them with the right training, either purchasing or developing the right content for those people, frankly, it just requires more thought, requires more effort, more discernment about what they need. So I think of those people as like the middle management of your compliance program. And in my experience, they're often not given the tools and training that they need to be successful. So I would definitely try to hone in on that group.
Yeah, I totally agree because they're not in the top of the food chain where all the responsibility lies, and they're not on the workshops or doing all the work, so they do not come in contact with all the export controlled goods and so on. And I also agree with what you said in the beginning that you should always prepare to be proactive, but be ready to be reactive as well. So you do not miss out on the ad hoc needs as well. And how do you determine the roles that require export control training within a company?
I think it should really be derived from your program, right? From your compliance program. So you should have, and this is how training interacts with the rest of the program, right? You should have procedures that detail, who's responsible for different procedures, right? And an organization that doesn't have this, it's going to be a bit of a mess probably. And often it's going to be just like the one person who's designated to be responsible for export controls or trade compliance who gets sort of tapped on the shoulder. And anytime something goes wrong, everybody goes to this person and expects them to go ahead and get it done. But that is definitely not the way it should be done. The way it should be done is you should have procedures or work instructions that explain what's going to be done and who is responsible, right, for that particular task. And anybody who's identified as having a specific responsibility, and sometimes this is by name, sometimes this is by group or department or title, right? But all of those people, you can't expect people to get things done, right, or get them done well, unless you give them the information and the support. And part of that is training that they need in order to be able to do that. And in companies, there's usually two parts to that. There's like the regulations, like the aspects of the rules which are relevant to them, right? So, for example, if you're an engineer who's responsible for doing product classification, well, that person needs to be trained on what that is. Don't just throw a control list at them and tell them to figure it out. You might get lucky, but that's probably not going to work very well, right? So you need to give them the right tools and training. And that should mostly be derived from what your procedures say as far as who is responsible. So it's really downstream from that. I mean, another mistake that I see people make is they just think like more training is better, right? We give more people more training more often, and that will be, lead us to a better result. And in fact, it's often counterproductive, right? What you want is the right level and the right types of training, right, directed at the correct audiences, right? It's more efficient, it's more respectful of other people's time, and it's going to work a lot better, cheaper than just trying to pile as much on as possible on everyone.
Yeah, because the ones that's receiving the training got to feel that the training is relevant, otherwise they won't listen to it fully.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in terms of frequency and depth, what factors influence the decision-making process for that?
So I could think of a couple things, right? So as far as like frequency goes, you've got to make a decision about it, right? And it's almost always going to be somewhat arbitrary, I think, about the frequency that's required. So I see companies that have policies on this, right? They'll say, people in certain roles, right, or with a certain level of responsibility need to have some sort of training at a certain level, however you measure that. If it's terms of how deep it is, if it's a matter of the duration of the training. Some companies will designate like approved providers where they'll let people choose, from a number of options, but they maybe have a list of 2 or 3 that they think are quality. And then they decide, is this going to be something that's annual or semi-annual? There really are no standards for this. There's certainly the US government has no particular standards for this, or in the ITAR in particular, right, in the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, there's this concept of an empowered official, which is, I think, much misunderstood, but this is supposed to be somebody who understands the regulations. But even then, there's and it has some training or understanding on the rules, but there's absolutely no standards for really what they're supposed to know or how frequently they're supposed to be updated. So I think you have to make some judgment calls about that. I think that at the level where you've got, at the more basic level, what's maybe more important than the frequency of that basic level training is driving ongoing awareness. So it's not just a one-off, if it's once a year, right? It's not just that kind of once a year reminder or refresher, but there should be also triggers for it, right? So there are some, I think, pretty clear triggers, like if there are changes to the rules, and we've seen a lot of changes to the rules, in the US and the EU, right, and elsewhere over the last couple of years, particularly when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to certain export controls with regard to China. Part of keeping on top of those changes is understanding that can necessitate that you have to refresh or revise or supplement the training that you've rolled out to people. So I think changes to the rules are one. Also, changes to the organization would be another, right? So that would be corporate restructuring, right? Getting into different lines of business, responding to those sort of external forces, right? Probably at least as important as having some sort of reasonable, achievable internal schedule in terms of frequency of training. And I think we talked about how to sort of target the people who might need those levels of training.
Yeah, and how do you do that? How do organizations tailor training to stay current with, for example, regulatory changes?
Kind of depends on your approach, right? What your model is for keeping people up to date. Some people do more of this internally. Some of them rely more on external providers. So if you're relying on an external provider, you should have clear understanding of what they're going to do and what's going to be updated for them. We have, we periodically, ECTI, we periodically do training that's specifically just about updates in order to give people an option for keeping current on things, right? An external option that people seem to find appealing, right, or popular to be able to do that. So I think there's different ways to approach that.
Yes, and moving on to another subject, in the light of the pandemic, we have learned to do certain things remotely or online. So what key considerations should companies weigh when choosing in-person versus e-learning for compliance training?
So they're both good options, right? So they're both valid options, but they're not the same, right? And they have advantages and disadvantages. And I think when we talk about this, it's important to understand what we mean. So there's different ways to go about this. So there's sort of, let's start with in-person, right? So in-person training, right? When ECTI got started, and actually I attended, you mentioned going to the Amsterdam seminar. I actually went to the Amsterdam seminar as a participant in, I think, like 2003 or 2004. That was my first exposure to it. And I remember being just sort of overwhelmed by it at the time, but that was mostly because of my own ignorance, right? Like my own need for more, or all the gaps in my understanding. But in-person training, I think, is really good for intense learning over a relatively short period of time. There's really not, I think to me, it is better for that kind of learning for people who are trying to learn the regulations, learn the rules, learn how to build compliance programs, and to do that as quickly as possible. I don't really think that there's a better way to do it than to do it in person. Why? Because you get access to the instructors, right, in real time. You can ask them questions. You can speak with them also offline, right, at breaks, before and after, depending on what kind of training you go to and how accessible how accessible people are. You go to something where there's like 800 people there, you're probably not going to get a lot of time with the, with the instructors, right? So that's the difference between kind of like a big conference versus more of a focused seminar. And you want people to be able to, at the right program, you've got not just lectures, right? But you've also got exercises. You've got different activities that are built in to learn in different ways. And in my experience, that all is just more effective in a shorter period of time when you're in person. When you're in person, you can also learn from other people who are there, right? More readily.
Yes.
Okay. So your peers, some of whom, even though export controls affect a lot of industries, they affect a smaller number of industries at a deeper level. So people often find that they have their, people who work for their customers, people who work for their suppliers are there. So it's a great way to learn from and make contacts with other people. So I think that in terms of getting things done in depth for people who are looking to really build expertise in a short period of time, it's in person tends to be more effective. When you're thinking about learning, right? It's then important, I think, to distinguish among the basic types, right? So you have instructor-led e-learning. So you can have something where it's remote. This is what a lot of people experienced during the pandemic, right? And like, a lot of children who were learning from home, which we're now learning, right, was in a lot of cases not ideal for them, right? There was a lot of, and I expect it's probably true for adults also, right? There were a lot of children who were sent home to learn over Zoom, did not learn, the way that they would had they been, right, in school. But you have instructor-led learning, right? So you can have remote learning. This could be in a webinar. It can be structured as more of a course over time. I think we're moving towards more and more of that, right? But you still have access to the instructor in that format. So you're still able, hopefully, to ask questions, get responses. It's very hard to interact with other people, with peers in that format. Sometimes it's possible, but even where it's possible, a lot of people in my experience don't take advantage of it, like in the chat rooms or whatever. And then there's e-learning that is more on demand, right? And this is also an area where there's been a lot of growth and can be very beneficial, where people do it at their own pace, right? So, we offer products that are like that, right? Which is you get access to it, it's online, and you work your way through it at your own pace. So that's really good for some people, right? So people who don't want to travel to go somewhere to learn, right? Want to do it over a longer period of time. Some people can't travel. Some people have disabilities, people have family commitments that make it impossible to travel. I think these people were kind of largely ignored when we were thinking about, in person, and just expected, hey, if you want to do this, you can show up. So advantage of that is it can be less expensive, right? It can be more accommodating of people's schedules, right? And other commitments that they might have. It allows them to go back and review things, right, multiple times. So if you want to zero in on a particular concept, you can literally rewind and listen to it again. That's obviously not something you can do in person. You can ask questions to try to, enhance your learning or clarify a certain concept. So I think really, all of these have advantages and disadvantages to them. If you're thinking about this from a manager of a program, right, of a compliance program, I think it's important to keep those pluses and minuses in mind and understand you might want, some of each, right? Some of each of these in order to be able to have the most effective combination of training modes for people in the specific people in your organization, right?
Yeah, yes, I totally agree. And I used to say that the backbone of the training is usually better done in person. But then if you need like some small updates or like a small refresher, that could be done through e-learning as a beneficial complement to the in-person education.
Yeah, and a lot of people now have, one of the sort of ongoing, I think, impacts of the pandemic is we now have more, we already have, right? But we have more distributed teams, right? There's more people who are working in the same functional organization, but are working in different countries, entirely different parts of the world, where it's just not practical to bring them all together in one place, or it ends up being a lot costly to do it that way. And so I think that's another reason why we're going to see people continuing to rely upon whether it's instructor-led, which has some advantages, or it's more of the on-demand approach.
Yeah. And how do you think the shift to digital learning has impacted the effectiveness of export control training?
This is a tough one to assess, I think, because as an instructor, I'll say, as someone who does a lot of teaching, right? I definitely prefer teaching in person, right? Because when you teach in person, right, if you have some appreciation and you're attentive to the learners who are there with you, right, you can understand and pick up on who's paying attention, who's not, what seems to be their interest level in this. Do people seem to be understanding it or not? And is it something that you need to revisit or give another example or walk through some, sort of scenario for them? And you get more real-time human feedback when you do it that allows you to adjust your approach in real. Now, not everybody does this, right? Some people are going to pound away with what they're going to do no matter what. But ideally, I think you are able to tailor your approach in real time to what you're seeing and hearing, some of which is very subtle and it's more body language than anything else. Whereas you do some training, when you do instructor-led training where I'm training people who are there, somewhere there on Zoom or Teams or whatever, right? And sometimes, you get just a blank screen of letters, right? I did training a couple of weeks ago for this company, and they do very sensitive kind of what they do. So they told me up front, hey, nobody is allowed to use their cameras when we have meetings for security reasons. So, it's just me in this sea of tiles where I'm not getting any reaction from people, not seeing anything. So I think it's very hard to assess what people are learning in that situation. And that some people are paying a lot more attention than other people are. Frankly, that's true in person also. So one way to deal with this, okay, is to have some sort of knowledge checks, right? Some sort of knowledge checks, some sort of quizzes. You can get to more serious assessment, right? Or more in-depth assessment if that's what you're trying to achieve, right? But there's ways to do it that are a little bit more casual and ways that are a little bit more serious where you're trying to verify that people have actually learned it, right? And this is something you can do when you have on-demand e-learning too, because we all know, I'm going to single you out, Anders, not looking for you to admit it, but we all know that people, particularly if you're in a company, as pushing all kinds of different training at you over the course of the year and you have to complete certain things. We know that some people open that up and they don't, they're off doing something else in another window. They go up to get a cup of coffee and think of it as a break. So that's why people build in, checks or quizzes to those to try to enforce some level of attention, right, to the subject matter. So those are, I think, some of your options for it. But that's why I think when you are doing e-learning, it's more of a challenge to assess that and confirm that people are engaged. More of a challenge, certainly.
Yeah, because when you're in person, you can get a feel for if the audience is on the same level as you're speaking, or if not, you can adjust your way of speaking so that it fits the crowd.
Ideally. Right. Ideally. Not that it's always easy in person either, but ideally, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think there is any best practices for blending in-person and e-learning?
Yeah, I think so. Right. So I think it goes back to your plan. So a hybrid of some sort is often effective, but it can be a hybrid in terms of how it's structured, right? So it could be that you decide, at that basic introductory awareness level, right? E-learning is a great option for that, right? We tell people, we have something that maybe takes 30 or 45 minutes. It's assigned to everybody. It's in our system, or they go to some outside system to access it. And we're able to track all of that and send them reminders that they've done it. We've got a quiz at the end or something so that, they haven't just gone off to make a cappuccino or whatever, right? We know that they've at least paid some attention to it. And that can be great in terms of structure for using e-learning. Whereas maybe if we're zeroing in on the people who we expect to be the points of reference, right, and points of contact within the organization, the subject matter experts, maybe for those people, if we're big enough, right, or we can get enough people in the room, maybe we bring in an outside instructor to help us with that, or we do it ourselves, right? Some organizations can do it themselves. But we bring somebody in to do it in person. We really tailor it to our organization. We have loads of opportunity for not just working with the instructor, but to discuss things amongst ourselves as a team that can be very, very valuable in that context, where sometimes training almost is it's almost more of a team building, right, and collaborative exercise. So you can build it structurally that way. You can also have a hybrid where there are courses, including some that we have, right, where you're working together, right, with other people in a class over a period of time. So maybe you're building in some, even if there's no in-person element, right, you're building in some instructor-led classes, right, with doing work in between classes, right, on certain topics, working through case studies, working in teams. So you can have a hybrid that brings together some aspects that are instructor-led, some aspects that are more on-demand or kind of learner-led, depending on what you think is going to work best for your organization.
Yep. And after the training is done, what happens next? How can companies effectively extend awareness of trade compliance beyond the training classroom?
So I think this is an overlooked area where we've been talking mostly here about kind of formal training of one kind or another, right? You have plan, you have a curriculum, and then you go and execute on it. But I think what you're asking about is more like awareness or driving awareness, right, outside of, the real or virtual classroom environment. And I think this is undersold, right? Because the thing about trade compliance is it's super operational, right? There's just a million tasks that need to get done, or loads of areas where people need to be thinking about trade compliance throughout a typical organization, right? And so there's lots of people in places where they need reminders about things, or you have opportunities to do it. So for one that I've seen a lot of different approaches to this, but one that I thought was really good and interesting, anybody who's ever worked for like an oil and gas company or a place that is poses where there's real risks to human health and safety, right? And I remember, I used to work for a tech company, and it always seemed like the health and safety guy didn't have enough to do because he seemed to spend most of his time shouting at people to put lids on their coffee cups so they didn't accidentally spill some coffee and burn somebody. But there's places where you can seriously get killed, right, if you do something wrong or expose your colleagues to radiation poisoning. So pretty serious. So those places tend to integrate into their meetings. They'll have something called like the safety minute. I don't know if you or any of your listeners have heard of this, but like where they'll, at the beginning of each meeting, somebody at the meeting, usually it's a volunteer, will for literally no more than a minute, right, talk about safety, something they learned about safety, something they can share, an experience they had, to bring that continued focus on safety, right, because it's so important in those places. What about doing some version of that for trade compliance, right, where it's bringing in that kind of day-to-day experience into all kinds of different interactions that people have, but instead of being about safety, right, maybe it's about trade compliance. Also, reminders from people, integrating it into communications. I remember one of the worst conversations I ever had with a manager was when trade compliance is people often don't know like where to put it within the organization. So trade compliance people often end up reporting to people who sometimes don't really know much about what they do. And so I remember I had one meeting where I was reporting to like the finance guy, the finance director at the time. And I knew I was in trouble when he said, "So what do you do here exactly?" Right? That's never a good thing. Never a good thing to hear from your manager. But you may need to communicate with people more regularly and have more of a strategy for how you communicate about trade compliance, again, outside of formalized training. And so this might be, an email that you send people. It might actually be some kind of newsletter or update or something that you're doing in Slack. But an opportunity to maybe also, another thing to think about is how can you get into more meetings or more events, right? Get invited to them. So you have more of an opportunity to educate and provide perspective where people might not have understood that it was something that where trade compliance could be an issue. I experienced that a lot when I was working in-house. So I've seen some people use apps to drive, apps that within the company already has. So as much as possible, I think you want to build upon the existing culture and tools that you have, but there's lots of different ways to do it. But it is really important to think about how you can drive awareness of important aspects of trade compliance outside of the classroom environment.
And that's what you're saying there. It feels like for me that you're talking of like culture of compliance within an organization. And how do you how do you approach that topic of culture of compliance? What approaches has been successful in promoting like safety culture within compliance?
A couple things. First, you need to set your expectations about that, right? That's a long-term project, right? You don't, even if you have a neutral culture, say today, where it's not that, not negative, right? That would be worse, right? Where people are hostile to compliance or view it as an impediment, right? Or actively undermine efforts at compliance, because that happens out there too. But even if you're starting from sort of a neutral situation, understand that building that kind of culture is going to take time, and it's going to take continued effort, right? And kind of an iterative approach where you're trying different things to see what works and keeping at it literally over years, right? In order to try to raise that culture to where it's something that is ingrained, it's kind of automatic throughout the organization. So plan on kind of the long-term approach. I think training can help with that, right? By giving people access to useful, relevant information. And this is why I think this is even more true outside the US than it is in the US, although it's also true in the US. It's important, I think, not to spend a lot of training, or too much training is like, here's all the terrible things that are going to happen to you, right? Or here's all the awful, we could be penalized, and it's easy to point to those figures, right? And, because there's lots of cases I can point to in the US at least where there have been penalties in the tens, hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars. People are sentenced to prison terms all the time who are committing, deliberate violations of the law. But the thing is that, could those things happen? Do those things happen? Yeah, they happen, right? And not just in the US, although the penalties in the US tend to be higher, although perhaps we're seeing a bit more, I think, on the enforcement side in Europe now than we did in the past. That's my impression anyway. But too much of that, people tend to tune it out, right? They don't, it's important to give them that information. But I would emphasize more the business risks for a lot of people, right? The impact that could on their business, to help build that culture, help them understand why this is important and why it's relevant to them. So that's not, we could be fined this much. That's more like, we could lose access to this source of supply, right? We could no longer be able to make our products because we're not able to get our suppliers to deliver the components to us. We could lose access entirely to certain markets or not be able to support existing customers. We could undermine our credibility by saying we can do things or promising things that we can't deliver on because we're not trusted by our own government, right? Or by other governments on which we depend. So I think that's useful as well, but it's definitely a long-term project that requires that you get support from the top of your organization, right? So if you're not sure if you have like that sort of senior management support where they set the tone, they're the ones who help you with resources. They help you with enforcing the program, and resources including for training, but not only for training. It's why it's really important to start with, one aspect of training also that a lot of organizations don't do effectively is getting access to and briefing the most senior people in their organization. So that could be the board of directors for one. It could be senior management. And because that pays two dividends, right? That helps build senior management support to do everything else that you want to do, as well as actually getting the right information into the hands or the brains of those people who you need to rely upon to execute on aspects of the program.
Yes, of course. Without management commitment, you're not going anywhere with your trade compliance within your company. Moving on to external training versus doing it yourself. So what do you think are the key advantages of bringing in external experts for export control training as opposed to handle it internally, doing it yourself?
So you can do it either way. And I think, like you said, there's pros and cons sort of to each approach, right? So let's start with going to outside training. And I will be the first to admit that I have a bit of a conflict of interest here, right? But I'll try to play it as straight as I can. So outside training, getting external help from somebody like ECTI, right? What are some of the advantages? Okay. So you've got people who, and this is again, assuming that you pick the right provider. So you've got people who have a lot of expertise, right? And also a diversity of expertise, because when you're in an organization, you have kind of a soda straw view, right, of the universe, where you're very narrowly focused on your particular industry, the countries that you deal with, and you may know a ton about that little area, okay? But probably you don't have the kind of the breadth of experience, right, of an external provider who's kind of worked with people in a lot of different industries, trained people, answered questions kind of across the universe, right? So you get access to somebody who has a greater breadth of expertise. You get access to it's obvious, right? But you get access to ready-made content and curriculum, which is not, easy to develop, takes a lot of time. I mean, as somebody who spent hours working on that kind of stuff yesterday, it's going to spend hours when we're done today on developing and improving training curriculum. It's extremely time consuming to do that. So you're gaining access to someone who's already put in all that effort, right, to create something. In some organizations, there is a real credibility that's gained by going to an outside expert. I've heard this from people over and over again, right? From people who I know just as much about this stuff as, say, I do, right? But they tell me, people are used to, the insider, right, tells me they're used to seeing my face. They hear from me all the time. They don't necessarily, I'm sort of a broken record to them, whereas we bring in an external expert, they come with kind of a built-in automatic credibility about what they're saying, right? The accuracy of their information, how they put it in context. So that's something you can gain by going to an outside expert. So those are all, I think, important pros. Cons would be you don't have control, right? So as much control. So, yes, are you getting access to ready-made training content, materials? Yes, but maybe it's not a perfect fit for you, right? Maybe it's close, and you can often work with your provider to tailor it or customize it, right? But it's not going to be not to have been built from the ground up for your particular situation. I mean, that's not how this works, right? And then cost, right? It can be high quality training from whether it's e-learning or it's instructor led. Getting access to that can be, it costs something, and it's not always cheap, right? Depending on how you want to approach it. There's less expensive and there's more expensive ways to go about it. So I think those are some advantages and disadvantages to an outside provider. Doing it yourself, right? You have total control, right? You can create exactly what you think is the right fit for your organization, right? In terms of duration, in terms of content, in terms of technical areas that you're focused on. The modalities for it, you can do that all yourself. It reduces your hard dollar cost, right? Because you're not going out and paying somebody for access to a course or materials or an expert instructor. But, somebody's going to have to create it. And there's going to be a lot of time that people often underestimate that's involved in doing that. You know the business, right? You know your organization better than anybody, better than any outside provider is going to. And so that's a real advantage over somebody who's coming from the outside, even if they have some experience or know a little bit about your organization or your company, or even if they have some experience in your, with your industry or your technical area. The cons of it, doing it yourself, it can be slow. How are you going to develop all of this content that you need? How are you going to develop these courses in-house? People will sometimes tune you out because they feel like they've heard it before from you. If you've inadvertently, right, damaged your credibility, I see that sometimes, right? People they've made mistakes, they categorize something differently, or they explain something, it turns out that they weren't right about that, or they were too vague about it, or they made it seem like the sky was falling and it turns out it wasn't really that bad. So you may already have a credibility problem going into it, which is very hard to rectify, or you might just not have the expertise in-house, right? You might not be able to do that. A lot of organizations can develop their own training at kind of that awareness or introductory level. That's not that hard. It's the basics. There's a lot of stuff out there that's free that you can kind of use or draw from. Going up from there, I think, is more challenging to do. Not impossible, but more challenging to do yourself.
And in what situations do you recommend companies bringing in external resources?
You mean to actually conduct training?
Yeah.
I think if they need it done quickly, right? So if it's something that there's some urgency for it, which could be, it's often that there's been some sort of violation or there's an investigation that's going on. This is part of the corrective action, right? So if you need that done, there's a time sensitivity there. Then you're probably going to have to bring somebody in from the outside. If you have limited internal expertise, then yeah, you're probably going to need to get some sort of external help because you just don't have the capacity to do it yourselves. If you know, a lot of people are subject matter experts, but they're not comfortable doing training. They're not comfortable, teaching. They don't have the experience. They aren't comfortable in front of a group. These are not necessarily complementary skill sets. There's a lot of people who are like export control nerds, right, who can recite chapter and verse from the regulations and can analyze situations very well, but they're not necessarily good public speakers who can help people understand some of these more difficult topics. So if you don't have that capacity internally, then yeah, I mean, you should look outside for help, or you just need, you're not totally sure what you need and you're looking for advice or guidance on, what are best practices in the industry? What do our peers do? You need have a little bit of consulting to help steer you to the right sort of training program. An outside expert can help you with that piece of it, that more strategic piece to it.
Yeah, of course. And sometimes it could be the situation that you send, you have the trainer approach, where the trainer is being sent to for example, ECTI to have like this in-depth training, and then they go home to their company and tailor the internal compliance training for that company's situation specifically.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you have any success stories on store where external training has made a significant impact on a company's overall trade compliance?
Yeah, I think so. So I could think of one case with a client where we trained. This was an in-house engagement, right? So it was sort of private for them, and where they had a series of serious violations, right? And it was clear that part of the cause there was that there was it was a big, complicated organization, and there was just a lack of understanding of what the rules were and how they functioned across the people who were subject matter experts, but also the kind of people the next layer out who were sort of had jobs that touched on export controls, but weren't really given, the resources to implement it. And so we did sort of customize a tailored program for that company over a couple of years. And at the end of it, I feel like we sort of worked ourselves out of a job, right? Where we helped them get, we weren't the only ones doing this, right? They had people internally working on this too, but we helped them get to a level where they just had a much better base of understanding, and they could be much more confident that when they, in this case, they told the US government that they had fixed all these problems, implemented a training program, that they were rectifying this situation, that at the end of that period where we were engaged with them, they could just make a much better case. They had to, in order to get out of a kind of a monitoring agreement with the US government, they could make a much better case that they were in a much more effective, it had a much more effective team who were able to manage these issues within the organization, in large part due to the training that we were able to provide. So that was very satisfying. I really love I love the feeling of like helping people understand stuff, like learning from it, getting some, efficacy out of it directly, and that's true in like a kind of where we had one kind of big engagement with a client, but it's true really in any situation where I feel like somebody walked into it, they didn't grasp something or they didn't understand it. And by the time I was able to explain it and maybe answer their questions, they really understood the concept and then could apply it to make their job easier, right? And also to demonstrate to their boss peers that they're a more effective member of the team who can deal with these kinds of issues. That's probably how I get the most satisfaction out of doing this kind of work.
Yeah, it must be an awesome feeling to see a company, to see yourself and your training have that kind of impact on the company, and seeing that person that you are teaching to have that moment and see that now the trade compliance aspect has landed within them.
Yeah, it's really gratifying. I don't know if I sort of come from a family of teachers. My mother was a teacher and a principal, and my aunt was a school librarian, and my uncle was a teacher. And so I think there's sort of a piece in me that really wants to help people learn.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm looking at my sheet note here, and I am all out of questions besides one, and that is, If people want to contact you or come in contact or connect with you, how do they do?
Yeah, so a couple ways. They can visit ECTI's website, which is learnexportcompliance.com is one way. I'm also on LinkedIn, right, as Scott Gearity. So you can message me or follow me on LinkedIn. So those are probably the best ways to reach out.
That's awesome. And I think that this trade compliance talk has been really awesome, truly information packed, and we're almost homing in on the full hour. And I can't stress enough how informative and an awesome talk this has been. So big thanks to you, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Anders. It's very kind of you, and I'm glad I was able to join you and your listeners today.
Yes, and thank you for taking the time. It's been a pleasure.